My brothers and sisters, this afternoon, I will start off by sharing one ayah from the Quran. And this is an ayah of Surah Al-Tahrim, to be specific, ayah number 6. And I will jump straight into this ayah as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu qu anfusakum wa ahlikum nara. O you who believe, qu anfusakum, save yourselves, wa ahlikum, and your families from naran, a fire. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala furthermore describes this. عَلَيْهَا وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَةُ. The fuel of that fire are people and stones. عَلَيْهَا مَلَائِكَةٌ غِلَاظٌ شِدَادٌ لَا يَعْصُونَ اللَّهَ مَا أَمَرَهُمْ. The ones who are appointed to look over that fire are angels that are very harsh and severe, and they do not hold back and disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after being given a command. وَيَفْعَلُونَ مَا يُؤْمَرُونَ. And they follow suit. They do as they are told. In this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a command. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a command. And in that command, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presents a very harsh warning. How does this start off? What is the command? Qu. Qu anfusakum. Save yourselves. Now the word qu comes from the root word waqiya. And we hear the whole topic about taqwa and protecting yourselves in reference to taqwa when Ramadan comes around. There is no doubt about that. And taqwa and wiqaya is a shield that you protect yourself with from someone or something. Now, what is a protection? A protection, it varies under different circumstances. If it's raining outside, your protection is what? An umbrella. If it's raining harder, your protection is a bigger umbrella, boots, a raincoat. If there is a thunderstorm going outside, your protection is to come indoors. If there is a tornado, your protection is to get into the basement or the most inner room of your house. If there is a flood, your protection is to go on the roof. And if there is a hurricane, our protection is to go to Houston. To go to Houston. So depending on the circumstances you are in, that defines what protection you should use. The same, not only for a state of emergency, but for sports. If someone is playing football, the protection is different. When someone rides a bike or a motorcycle, the protection is different. When we are driving our cars, we buckle up. We try to buy a car. Well, now it's pretty much standard as far as airbags are concerned. But every aspect of our life, every field and area that we are involved in, someone works in a particular field that requires them to wear a hard hat. Someone is in a field that requires them to wear safety goggles. Physicians, they have to scrub up and protect themselves and their patient from the transfer of germs, and vice versa. Now, when someone doesn't take these precautions, they are putting themselves at risk and potentially putting others at risk. When someone is riding around in a motorcycle without a helmet on, they are putting themselves at risk. When someone is not careful about their seatbelt, they're putting themselves at risk. If you're not careful about it for your children, you're putting them at risk. So, if someone does not use these precautions, do we consider them wise? No. Oh man, he's such a daredevil. Oh, he doesn't buckle his safety belt. He doesn't wear a hard hat. Oh, he's so brave and he's courageous. No, we consider that person to be unwise. And to remind us about these things, we constantly see warning labels. Caution, attention, cuidado. which is Spanish for caution. Right? Even when we go to a store, if the floor is wet, there's a yellow sign that's put up. Why? Because there's the potential risk of slipping and falling. So we use protection in different areas in life. And we see different warning labels. And you know, sometimes it gets to a point that to enforce these things, there are certain laws that are in place. This is why law enforcement gives tickets when you don't wear your seatbelt, when you're riding your motorcycle without a helmet, for example. The tougher, the higher the risk, the tougher the consequence. If you're not wearing a seatbelt, that ticket is not as harsh as getting your child getting caught not being in a car seat. Correct? So the higher the risk, the tougher the consequences, and the harder the enforcement. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse of Surah Al-Tahrim is telling us to protect ourselves and our families from a fire. Let's talk about fire. People that fight fires, firemen, do they just go in their regular civilian clothes? Oh, you know what? They're going to be fighting a fire. Obviously it's going to be hot, so let me get in my Bermudas. No. The uniform and gear that they are made to wear, it becomes so hot for them. But this is how they have to protect themselves from a fire. Now, each and every single one of us, we all know and have an understanding of what the characteristic and what the nature of a fire is. This is something that we don't need to be taught. This is something that even a baby can understand. Right? Sometimes, you know, if there's a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and a baby gets close to it, they feel the heat. When they touch it, their hand will move right away. This is the natural instinct that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has embedded within the human being. We don't need to teach a baby these things. Now, and we all know what a fire can do. Many of us who work in Mid-City and downtown, we see the remnants of the building that caught fire on Canal Street. There's an apartment building on Vintage that had a huge fire. The whole roof is gone. So we know what a fire does. Some of us will be firing up the barbecue this weekend. We know what a fire does. And no one in their right mind plays with fire. But there are different levels of fire. There's a difference between an inferno and a lighter. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He tells us to protect ourselves and our families from a fire, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains the severity of this fire so we can realize the magnitude of the consequences. Remember, the higher the risk, the greater the consequence, the greater the warning. You're not going to find a little sticker in front of a factory. You're going to see a big sign. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this fire. وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَةُ. This is a very harsh, eye-opening, gruesome and monstrous description of the fire of hell that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given in the Quran. It is up there in the top 5 of the harshest descriptions of the fire of hell. Now we know in a fire needs something to sustain it, something to fuel it, something that it keeps on going with. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this fire, وَقُودُهَا النَّاسِ. The fuel of this fire will be people. وَالْحِجَارَةِ. And stones. وَقُودُهَا النَّاسِ. People who have been unfaithful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People who have been hurtful to other fellow human beings. People who have the burden of sin. Starting from shirk and all the way below that. This will be the fuel that the fire of hell will thrive on. وَالْحِجَارَةِ. and stones. Some Mufassirin explain that it means the stones that idols were carved of. Those stones that pagans would worship will also be thrown in that fire to show them where they ended up with the ones they worshipped. Some Mufassirin draw a parallel of those stones to the characters of lava. How intense and fiery lava is. That is how the fire of hell will be fueled. Imagine how intense lava is. That is the fuel for the fire of hell. There is a mursal hadith related by the Prophet ﷺ by Ibn Abi Hatim, in which the Prophet ﷺ recited this hadith amongst a few Sahaba, and there was an elderly person, and he said, Ya Rasulullah, Hijaratu Jahannam ka hijarati dunya? Will the stones of hell be like the stones of this earth? The Prophet ﷺ explained, Walladhi nafsi biyadi. I swear by He who holds and controls my life, one rock in the fire of hell will be equivalent to all of the mountains of this world put together. فَوَقَعَ الشَّيْخُ مَغْشِيًا عَلَيْهِ. And this person, he felt unconscious about hearing this. So this is not something to sneeze at. The first, second, and third degree burns that people deal with in this world is nothing compared to the constant cycle of punishment, the constant burning and melting away of the flesh, and then the reproduction of that flesh. So it can constantly hurt. Adhabun alim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has explained the punishment of the hereafter as alim, something that constantly pains you. When we get injured in this world, the first day it hurts the most. The second, the third day, as time goes on, we develop a tolerance for that. It doesn't hurt as much. The body, it functions in a way where it starts easing that pain. Alim is something that constantly gives pain. Something that you cannot develop a tolerance against. Now, I'm not going to go into the description furthermore into the description of the fire of hell with the limited time that I have. But let's go back to the beginning. قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ. Save yourselves and your families. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from fire, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us and commanding us to do something that most of humanity, I would hope so, most of humanity already understands. Let's think about it. As a human being, would you walk into a pit of fire? No, you probably would not. I would hope so. Okay? Would you put your hand on top of the barbecue? I would hope that you wouldn't do that, brother. Okay? So most of humanity knows not to play with fire. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not talking about the fire of this world. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave this gruesome description of the fire of hell. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to protect ourselves from the consequences of certain deeds that will result and manifest into this huge burning inferno that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls the fire of hell. But in spite of this, a lot of humanity, they get involved in and they commit things that land a person into this fire of hell. Now, brothers and sisters, just as we take precautions to save ourselves from the fire of hell, from the fire in this world, we take precautions, right? Let's take the example of a smoke detector. What is a smoke detector? It is a very inexpensive device that is implanted in our house to warn us. Does it go off after the whole house is on fire? That would be pretty crazy, right? You would definitely want your money back. When does it go off? When it senses slight burning or a little bit of smoke. When you start doing heavy cooking, it goes off. And indeed, sometimes it becomes a huge inconvenience. Especially when you're cooking a lot at home. Or if you put toast in if you like your toast a little darker like me, the smoke detector goes off. But do we get rid of that smoke detector? Of course we don't. We may take the battery out while we're cooking, but we don't get rid of it. So just as we take precautions to save ourselves from the risk of getting burnt in this world, we should also take precautions and stay well away from those things which will cause us punishment in the hereafter. And this is iman and a'mal. Faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to follow suit with our deeds. Now let's focus on one thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, save yourselves and ahlikum, and your family. My brothers and sisters, who over here is throwing our kids into the fire right now? As parents, we naturally protect our children. We love our children. We want to give them the best. We want to give them things that we did not have. We sacrifice our rest and our sleep so they can sleep in peace. We sweat so they can live in comfort. We work so many hours so we can afford them opportunities and the luxuries that maybe we did not enjoy. Remember the example I gave about a baby touching the cup of tea? Right? Now, imagine there's a hot cup of tea, chai, or a hot cup of coffee, or there is something on the stove. You put a pot of food on the dinner table. Which parent in here would allow their young child to touch that pot with the intention that, you know what, this is how I want him to learn his lesson? Really? No, let him touch it, because if he touches it once, if he burns himself once, he will not burn himself again. Who in their right mind allows their little infant to stick their finger in an electrical outlet with the intention that, you know what, let him get shocked once. He's never going to do that in his life. He will be an advocate against putting those safety things inside the outlets. Let it happen. Who in their right mind would do that? I would hope no parent in here would allow that to happen intentionally. So the concern that we have for our kids is naturally embedded in us. And it is a fundamental part of our deen. Having a worry and concern for a child is something that is chimed in the Quran for the first time by the mention of Nuh alayhi salam. Ya bunayya arkab ma'ana wa la takum min al-khasirin. The worry and concern for a child is something that echoes in the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam when he is heading back towards the Holy Land after leaving his wife and child in Makkah. رَبَّنَا لِيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ إِنِّي أَسْكَنْتُ ذُرِّيَّتِي بِوَادٍ غَيْرِ ذِي زَرْعٍ عِنْدَ بَيْتِكَ الْمُحَرَّمِ رَبَّنَا لِيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ. He is worried about his family. So this is something, the parental worry and concern for one's children is something that is echoed very frequently in the Quran. And this is a challenge that each and every single one of us who has children will have to deal with. And everyone's challenge will not be the same. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he dealt with children who were very obedient, who eventually became the flag bearers and the torch of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they became prophets. Nuh alayhi salam, on the other hand, dealt with children who literally were not on boat. So everyone will have a different test. Just look at those of us who are parents, okay? Even within our children, there are some children that we will struggle with, that we are struggling with, while other children who are very obedient. So this is a challenge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts upon everybody. Look at Yaqub alayhi salam. Two of his children, very obedient. And the rest he struggled with. Eventually, they did tawbah and they followed suit. But he had this constant struggle. So everyone's experience with our children is definitely different. But nevertheless, we have to be worried about them. قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا. And my brothers and sisters, In order for us to protect our children, we have to protect ourselves. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا. When we go on a plane, and when they talk about the oxygen pressure getting low, what do they say? Put the mask on yourself first before assisting others or your children. قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا. Brothers and sisters, we have to be, I'm not standing here telling any single one of you parents that, you know what, you don't care about your children. Please don't take this from this khutbah. Everyone is worried and concerned about their children. But I want to stand here today to remind myself and each and every single parent in this hall that to remind ourselves, what are we worried about? We are protecting our children from what? Is it only financial instability? Is the only thing we are worried about protecting our children from is getting a B in subjects? Brothers and sisters, we as parents need to protect our mentality. We need to protect our mentality so our children can be saved from that mentality that would lead them towards the fire of hell. If the only thing we are worried about as parents is education, education, education. If the only thing we talk about on the dinner table are finances, are bills, oh look, oh his son got into this school, her daughter got married to that person, or look at which subdivision he moved in, look at what car he is driving. We don't have to teach we don't have to go up to a child and say, you know what, this is what success is. In a car, and a house, and a good education. And by the way, education is boiled down to how much money you can make. We don't have to say these things specifically. Our actions and the words that we say based on the mentality, these things change a child's mentality. You know what? My parents gave so much stress on this, and they lived their lives with total disregard for everything else. As long as I get an A, my son and my daughter can do whatever they want. Nothing else matters but this. This mentality, it develops in their mind, and it will sprout out when they become an adult. That, you know what? I can go in this type of business, nothing else matters. I can do this, nothing else matters. This is all that matters. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَةُ. What really matters is to mold ourselves and mold the mentality of our children in a direction that they will be able to save themselves from the fire of hell. And that comes with spending time with our children, wholesome time with our children. Brothers and sisters, how can we expect our children to care about what we say, especially as fathers, when the only interaction we have with them is 5 to 10 to 15 minutes? When we leave the house and they're getting ready for school, and we come back and they're ready to go to sleep. And a lot of times we are just pushing hours and pushing jobs, not to, make ends meet, but so we can maintain a certain status amongst the community. This is a huge disservice to our children. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to realize this before it's too late. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروا إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.